All right, we're all set. Cool. Prathana, so to start off first, Prathana is going to give us like a quick introduction of the group.
Sure. Thank you. All right, welcome everyone. I'm very glad to see some new faces today. Some of you might have attended our previous events and might already be familiar with Software Guff-Gaff, but I'm going to give a short introduction. Software Guff-Gaff is a community for Nepali identifying software practitioners, students, and professionals to come together for knowledge sharing or to just get connected with each other. As we all know, technology or software field is rapidly growing in Nepal and outside too. So we created this group to serve as a platform to bring people together to allow us to learn from each other's experience and expertise. So far, we've done various kinds of events, talk programs with a guest, like the one we're going to be doing today, experience sharing by community members, networking events, and open discussion on a technical topic. We host events on a monthly basis, which are usually recorded, and we post those recordings later on YouTube. So even if you miss some of the events and do want to check out our events later, you can do that. We're primarily an online community. We have groups on Facebook and LinkedIn. Um, we're also looking for community members to get involved, and there are many ways to do so. First is by leading one of these monthly events. So if you're interested, you may give a talk on any topic that you're interested in. You could share a project, pitch an idea, or share a learning experience. Anything goes as long as it's connected to the topic of software. We want this group to be primarily community driven. So if you have any ideas on anything you want to share with other people, please do reach out to us. We're also always looking for volunteers to help us out in the organizing team. So if you're interested in hanging out with us on planning these monthly events, please reach out to myself or Abhishek. And one last thing before we start, we'll share a link to a feedback form at the end of the event, and we'd love to get your feedbacks. So please fill it out if you have time. So that was all. I'll hand it back to you, Abhishek.
Well, thank you, Prathana. So today's event is the Guff-Gaff with guest event, and our guest today is Dr. Topraj Gurung. Dr. Topraj Gurung is a software engineer at Google and is currently based out of Mountain View, California. He did his schooling in Gandaki boarding school and then his ISc in St. Xavier's College. His undergrad, master's, and PhD from Georgia Institute of Technology, Georgia Tech. Since then, he's worked at Google, Facebook, and a startup before coming back to Google. You can learn more about Dr. Gurung in his personal website, topraj.com. Dr. Topraj Gurung, welcome to Software Guff-Gaff.
Hey, thanks, Abhishek.
Cool. So why don't we start off by your software journey? Like, when did this fascination with software or programming start? When did you first learn programming? Did you always have like computers accessible to you growing up? Like, I'm curious about how this journey started.
Yeah, so for my personal journey, like, so म चाहिँ स्कुल चाहिँ गण्डकीपुरीमा पढेको पहिला अनि एसएलसी चाहिँ this was like a long time ago. This is 1997 होइन and back then computers were a new thing गण्डकी बोर्डिङमा चाहिँ अनि we didn't really have a programming course per se. They used to teach us like Microsoft Word, Excel, typing, those kind of standard like things.
Yeah.
And it was fun, it was a new thing, it was fun, it was so SLC पछि चाहिँ सेन्ट जेभियर्समा पढ्ने बेलामा चाहिँ when I was in like the first year, त्यो बेलामा चाहिँ दुईजना ब्रदर्स पोखरेल ब्रदर्स like अतुल and अनुरोध, they're actually like US based right now, East Coast based, and उनीहरूले चाहिँ they did like this introduction to Pascal programming. When Pascal used to be this language before, like all the Java and all these things nowadays. And Pascal programming भन्यो अनि like it didn't really hit me. It was like, it was interesting. Like it was like after school event, they just like did this thing. Maybe 5 or 10 people showed up. We were like, hey, what is this thing? We attended and it didn't really hit me. Like it sort of made sense, but didn't make sense, but it didn't really make sense. तर 12 कक्षा पछि चाहिँ like for some weird reason, I said, hey, like let me try and build this game.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when you were a little kid, like the 15 number game, and then you like plastic, and you like used to like put all the numbers 1 through 15 in sequence, and then you have like a space that you can move around.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that was basically the game I built. And a very simple game, right? But just like to be able to build that really simple game and make that a reality, it was just like this eye-opening experience. Like, it felt like this superpower, right? Like
Yeah.
it was like for loops, if statements, like I'm like, what's the point of all this when you could was building that game, like wow, now I really understand what this was. So I think that's sort of like kickstarted the whole thing. Topraj immediately did a bunch of games. Nepalma Huँदाहुँदै did like a bunch of independent projects just on my own. And that's sort of like how the journey started. Like initially it was like this two brothers, like Poktu brothers, who were just like giving this talk on, hey, this thing called programming, and then it was interesting but not that interesting. But then Barkatsepachi saying like did this game and like wow, like it's so powerful, and it was like like this magical thing. So that's sort of like how it started.
Mm. And was it like accompanied by official courses in like St. Xavier's, and is did you pursue like the engineering path there too, or
Yeah,
was it mostly
so
a side hobby?
it was a side hobby. St. Joseph's campus by itself, like they back then they had a physics track and a biology track. The biology was for the medical doctors, and physics was for quote unquote engineers, right? Like the catch-all
Mm,
for everything, right? Whether it's a civil engineer, a computer scientist, and all. So to officially course or the Thena, it was post ISC, I should say, right? Because like it gets pretty busy with ISC and everything. Post ISC, it was basically like this project. And then I took a bunch of courses, and it was very interesting. I wanted to learn more about this thing. So this sort of like, but a lot of self-studying, obviously. Yeah.
mm. How was the resources like back then? Like these days, we would be like, okay, everything is in the tip of your keyboards, right? You
Yeah.
can Google, and
I
there's like tons of
I feel
programming
very
resources.
yeah, I agree. Like I feel so jealous, right? Let's say if you're like a little kid who is like, I don't know, 10th grade, 11th, 12, like you have access to like infinite access to resources. So I feel
Hmm.
very jealous. To Belama saying like this is like the level of like funniness, right? So you had a particular game build with you, and same thing. I didn't know a specific set of thing. Only I
Hmm.
had really limited access to internet because like it was internet was still a luxury back then. Until I mean it sort of wasn't, but it was. सो त्यहाँबाट चाहिँ महाङ्कलको तल चाहिँ यो काठमाडौँमा महाङ्कलको तल बुक स्टोर छ क्या प्रिटी स्योर स्टिल देयर राइट एन्ड त्यो
Hmm.
बुक स्टोरमा चाहिँ इट्स नट अलाउड obviously तर चाहिँ I would go and hang out there, and I would just be like opening these books on game programming and just like because I didn't, I might not have like that couple of ₹100 to buy that books. I would just be like going and looking at specific chapters and trying to understand the trick that needed to be done. And it's like that, right? So access to resources, maybe not so much. Like friends who were doing programming, very few, one or two, and it was just like scattered here and there. So very limited, but I guess yeah, it's just like the times are different now, right? So yeah, it was interesting and fun that way anyway.
Yeah, very cool. I noticed looking at your profile that you're also big into competitive programming. Can you give us a little bit of story on like how you got introduced to it, and maybe a bit about your competitive programming journey?
Yeah, like before that, like what is competitive programming, or rather like maybe start with like how I even got into this, right? So Georgia Tech when
Hmm.
I'm undergraduate here, and they have like a bunch of clubs there, right? Like any other
Yeah.
university. And one of the clubs was the ACM club, because the ACM is like the computer science equivalent of like whatever the big like computer science related club. And to club चाहिँ like people were signing up. I like, hey, it sounds interesting. Let's go join. And accidentally, त्योमा जाने बेलामा चाहिँ one of the meetups was for like this thing called competitive programming. And I went and I said, hey, I don't know what this is. Let's do this. And I just loved it, right? And I probably loved it for multiple reasons. It's like puzzle type of like so
Mm.
maybe what is competitive programming, right? Like so essentially this is like competitive programming was sort of like reasonably volume right before hackathons, like right around when I was nearing the end of my undergrad. Like hackathons were starting to like really pick up steam, right?
Mm.
Hackathons are big now, I'm guessing. But
Yeah,
back
yeah.
then saying competitive programming say that was like an outlet one just this thing that you do on the side. Besides that, you do research obviously, तर त्यो चाहिँ एउटा side थियो. So त्यो बेलामा चाहिँ के हुन्छ नि, it's a timed event. You might do it as an individual or as a team, and they give you a bunch of puzzles, and then you try and solve these puzzles. You write computer code, and then you just like submit it to some judge, whether it's online or like to your friend, and they
Mm.
will run it against a set of test cases. And if it is correct or not, you basically get a, usually you don't get partial credit. It's either a 0 or 1 binary, right? Just because it's
Mm.
easier to like do a diff on two different files. that's basically what competitive programming is like. It's a bunch, and it gets competitive. You can get ranked. You can actually go to like compete at regionals. You can go to world finals. You can do like a bunch of things like that. So it's interesting that way. But that's sort of like how I got like into it and how I got sort of hooked into it.
Mm, I see. Yeah, I'm curious to understand, learn if competitive programming you think has helped your career. Like, has it been like useful? It definitely makes you a very good like problem solver. I'm assuming that does translate into some aspects of your career as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think the biggest thing that I think it's been used nowadays more and more for is basically interview training. That's how. So like what ended up happening is this, right? Like software industry, I'm saying, right around when I was in my undergrad,
Hmm.
Microsoft was the thing. I mean, Microsoft is still like a big company now, but Microsoft was
Yeah.
the like company, right, to join.
Hmm.
On उनीहरूले चाहिँ they used to do like this more puzzle like questions के त्यो बेलामा. And this more algorithmic kind of question that you see nowadays, that is an evolution of sort of like that process of like interviews. So it definitely helps you in those kind of things because competitive programming गरेको छ भने you're exposed to a wide variety of algorithms. You're like
Hmm.
exposed to a lot of like different kinds of coding styles, like debugging things on the go, like on the very the fast time of like not in the comforts of your office, but like time pressure, time crunch. So it definitely helps you in that aspect. But to your point, right? Like problem solving money एकदमै help गर्छ होइन. Like again, like competitive programming, Georgia Techमा भन्ने बेलामा चाहिँ त्यो बेलामा चाहिँ the guy who used to run that thing when I joined, पछि चाहिँ मैले Georgia Techको टिमलाई कोच गरेँ होइन. तर पहिला चाहिँ David Van Brackle भन्ने एकजना चाहिँ community volunteer थियो. He didn't even like work at Georgia Tech. He was just like this guy who used to work in Atlanta, and he just loved this thing. So he just came and
Mm.
in the Bielka Belka Sundays and he would just like do this thing for us, and we'd spend 5 hours together just like doing this stuff on Sundays. On त्यो बेलामा चाहिँ he taught us a lot of stuff, right? Like just like algorithms and त्यो पनि भयो तर like there's many things about just general programming that he taught us. Like one thing that I obviously like think about every day nowadays is like what he called the idea of anti-debugging in some ways, and that's like some concept I think he invented, right? It was like every
Interesting.
like it's the idea of like when you're coding you code with this idea of like almost like a state of paranoia. I'm not saying त्यस्तो साह्रो त गर्नु पर्दैन तर like every statement and every for loops you're looking at how can this break, how can this like go crazy, right? And like
Mm.
his point was, hey, can you like do this in a conscious way so that over time it'll be going the subconscious and your bugs are minimized. And true to his like insight, right? Like it's really helped me a lot, right? Like okay, as an IC, like when I'm writing code, box it's like minimized a lot, so it allows you to be like much velocity faster ones and not a lot of frustrating time debugging some tiny little like if statement mistake here off by one issues. They would definitely helps you in like a broad set of like problem solving, like just like individual coding and also like interviews in general.
Mm. That is pretty interesting concept. So as you're typing code, you kind of always think yourself to like, what are the ways that this can actually go wrong as you're kind of
Yeah,
building it?
yeah, as at
And
a
that,
line by line level or at the block by block level or at the function by function level and ultimately granularity level of function may books and I see when you're
mm,
writing code.
yeah.
Whereas if you're like doing that kind of like very proactive like debugging, so it was like the idea of like anti-debugging, right? Like you are never in the state of debugging because you're sort of like anti done that. So like I should probably just like research and there's probably like software like principles and like this principle and maybe it's called a different word. He just used to call that thing that just because it was a funny way of play on with the word debugging, right?
Mm,
But these are like interesting ideas that emerged from there.
that's very interesting.
Oh,
I'm
the other
curious
thing
about your,
is
uh-huh.
probably actually like networking. Like त्यो बेलामा चाहिँ
Mm,
competitive programmingमा like the network is huge. Georgia Tech मात्रै नभएर like external अरू युनिभर्सिटीको मान्छेहरूसँग होइन. So this
mm,
network of people, they're all like placed all across Silicon Valley जताततै छ होइन, like in different kinds of roles. So this network is like very strong and it's always helpful, right? So,
yeah. Any way that you would suggest, like if somebody's interested into like venturing into competitive programming, how to like get into it?
yeah, so there's like multiple levels to it. Like if you want to do it exclusively online, I believe like nowadays, पहिला when I used to do it a long time ago, your top coder one is a site, but
Mm-hmm.
nowadays
Yep.
I don't think they're as big nowadays. I think if
Lead
you want
code.
to do this, yeah, lead code I think is like interview training, but you can sort of like think of it as sort of like like competitive programming. Or say I think coder chef when you say, okay, well, let me just like
Quarter
Code
chef.
Forces, sorry, not Code Forces on the site side. It's basically
Mm,
like it's like a bunch of like Russian folks who are running this competitive programming site, and it's like every week, every month, some kind of cadence ma चाहिँ online भइरहेको छ. त्यो चाहिँ अब online version मा you can like search for that, like Code Forces, top coders, and maybe also you could call lead code also like that.
mm,
But if you talk about like university level मा चाहिँ I don't know if नेपालबाट चाहिँ त्यो आउँछ तर अमेरिकन युनिभर्सिटीहरू लगायत युरोपियन कनेडियन युरोपियन अरू अब अस्ट्रेलियन चाइनिज इन्डियन सबै यहाँबाट चाहिँ युनिभर्सिटी लेभलमा चाहिँ दे हेभ दिस थिङ कल आइसिपिसी कन्टेस्ट जो चाहिँ
mm,
inter collegiate programming competition, I think, and that's like universities competing against universities. And also at the high school level, they have this thing called IOI, I think Informatics Olympiad, something like that, IOI. And high school level,
mhm,
you can actually, it's a more like a country versus country, like the US has a team, and then China has a team, and India has a team, and Russia has a team. But you
mm,
can still like engage in that in some form or the other. So there's like, for different kinds of levels, there's many different kinds of ways you can do this.
mm. Cool. Thank you for sharing that information. In regards to use of these maybe algorithm-heavy questions for screening candidates in a job interview, what are your thoughts around it? Because one perspective is that, oh, it's not necessarily uh, a good way to filter candidates or test candidates, because in reality, in your day-to-day job, it's rarely that you work in this algorithm heavy kind of scenarios. And even if you do, you don't have a time pressure of like 30 minutes to kind of solve it. Or another point of view, it is there is that, oh, it's just a way of like seeing how the person thinks. It's not necessarily that they have to get the problem right. As long as we get the thought process, then it's good. But I'm curious to, coming from a competitive programming background, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that debate.
I think, yeah, like I think the criticisms are valid, right? I mean, these are all like very warranted criticisms. तर चाहिँ अब you can, okay, so just like a background, right? Like अब अमेरिकामा चाहिँ like just for folks like from Dharan and Nepal, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
अमेरिकामा चाहिँ अब सिलिकन भ्यालीहरूको कम्पनीहरू चाहिँ उनीहरूले हायर गर्ने बेलामा चाहिँ यस्तै एल्गोरिथमिक क्वेसनहरू सोध्छन् कि अब ग्राफ थ्योरी क्वेसन भन्छ, डाइनामिक
Yeah,
प्रोग्रामिङ
yeah.
क्वेसन भन्छ होइन. तर क्वेसन सोध्छ तर यो ग्राफ थ्योरी प्रब्लम हो भनेर भन्दैन, एउटा पजल टाइपको क्वेसन दिन्छ अनि त्यसपछि you have to solve that and then also write code, and you have to solve the problem and also write the code, and hopefully the code is like actually like workable, or like to a certain level. अनि अब त्यसमा चाहिँ अब क्रिटिसिजम चाहिँ इज इट लाइक गन रिफ्लेक्ट द रियल डे टु डे वर्क भनेर भन्यो. अनि अगेन द प्रोज इज लाइक हे मेबी इट हेल्प्स like really bring out how you think about things भन्ने कुरा. I would say that besides the criticism, which are very valid, like if Silicon Valley had a better and a more scalable version of screening candidates at scale, I know, because
Mm,
you're talking about like scale, the scale is really huge, right? Very scalably, and especially, and also minimizing false positives, right? So by false positives, I mean when you're basically hiring somebody, there is high cost for hiring somebody who doesn't meet the bar for the company, right? त्यो भयो भने चाहिँ like the company has to like go through a lot of processes and maybe potentially even like fire that person. So it's a very like they want to minimize false positives in the sense that they want to make sure that कहिलेकाहीँ चाहिँ false positive हुने बेलामा चाहिँ कुनै कुनै एकदमै great engineerहरू पनि हुन्छ, software engineerहरू, but they missed those people. But they are sort of like fine because this is one of the most scalable ways they've found to be fairly
mm,
effective, right? And these companies at the scale that they run, whether it's Google, Facebook, or the smaller shops, or even like the smaller ones, which are all copying
mhm.
like each other, right? They've
Yeah, yeah.
like sort of like they do their own internal analysis, and they've shown again and again that this is a reasonable predictor of success in terms of like the kinds of like stuff they do, right? So I think that's one aspect. The other aspect is like when you think about your interview style, competitive programming aside, which is only tiny percentage of the total population,
Mm,
algorithms say, like if you think about it, like undergraduate education, like it's part of like data structures and algorithms. So in some ways, people are sort of like graph theory parts, right? You're sort of like supposed to know that, but even if you don't, कस्तो हुन्छ भने अब यो इन्टरभ्यूहरूको लागि चाहिँ टेक्निकल इन्टरभ्यूहरूलाई प्रिपेयर गर्नको लागि चाहिँ if you spend, like people sometimes spend like 2 to 3 months,
mhm,
lead course जस्तो साइटहरूमा जान्छ, they solve like 200 problems and 100 200 problems solve गर्छ over a matter of 2 3 months, and then they also practice and whatnot, and they get comfortable, and through that like they can now like demonstrate, hey, they know this thing, right? So if you like sort of like see the commitment at that level too, right? Like, hey, like they know it's a very open book secret in terms of like the kinds of questions companies ask,
Mm,
and these people are willing to invest and like put in that effort and time and effort to actually like do that. And obviously they might not get the question that they have been practicing for all similar style Paula, but they're still able to like prepare and adequately do that. That shows like strong commitment, shows strong motivation. There's a lot of good positive out of that. And yeah, but I say
mm,
I would argue that the overall system, although the criticisms are fairly warranted, like there hasn't been like a good scalable system that provides minimal false positive, and it's also is an effective in like getting really good candidates out of the system again in a scalable way.
mm.
And until that happens, right, and maybe like in 5 years, like some innovative platform will come around, because there are a lot of hiring tech companies right now who are focused on hiring itself, and maybe they come up with
Yeah.
like new methods. And companies are smart, right? They're going to pivot to whatever works and whatever is effective. They're not bound by this algorithmic thing. This is just a system they know works relatively well. And
Mm, I see. Thank you for sharing your perspective there. It is definitely one of the hotly debated items as
it
in a
is, yeah.
software industry. So you've worked in many big companies, household names like Google, Facebook, Netflix. In terms of engineering culture, like what have you observed in your time spent among like these companies? More so around Netflix, because apparently they have like a very strong kind of culture, which is a little bit different from the culture that you see in most tech companies in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. So I'd be curious to learn about your overall experience working in these big brand companies.
Yeah, big brand companies. So I would say like culturally speaking, they're obviously like similar, but we're talking about engineering culture, right? So like
Mm,
if you talk about like a company like Google, so Google को चाहिँ अब you could say like यसमा चाहिँ engineering अब कस्तो भन्ने engineering excellence एक हिसाबले एकदमै like methodically like doing things, being really के भन्छ design talkहरू गर्छ, like you really plan things ahead in time, you really have lots and lots of tests to make sure, integration tests, unit tests, all those kind of tests to make sure that things are working really good. The code is well documented. So it's like very
mm,
methodical and whatnot, right? Like in terms of like the pure at the function level. And
mm,
if you talk about a company like Facebook, their Facebook is very optimized. It's sort of like Facebook. You can view it as like a collection of a bunch of startups that are like
mm,
working autonomously. On this बेलामा चाहिँ फेसबुकको चाहिँ philosophy चाहिँ के छ भने they prioritize velocity a lot more, not as much as a startup, but like उहाँ चाहिँ अब engineering rigor at the level that Google probably does. I mean, obviously there is engineering rigor. You have to have engineering rigor, otherwise it's like not a good thing. But I'm saying the level that Google puts in, it's not that kind of like level. So things are going to be a little
mm,
bit faster. Velocity is much different. I would also say that tooling चाहिँ अब Facebookमा चाहिँ is much different, and probably they have like a lot of people from Google actually left and joined Facebook when Facebook started becoming bigger and stronger, right? And maybe they
mm,
saw a lot of stuff there and then try to improve and come up with like a better, different version over there. They were definitely tooling also. Definitely, it enables you to go much faster. Velocities and definitely much higher. So, but you would probably argue that engineering excellence र त्यसको चाहिँ फेसबुकमा चाहिँ like it's not as high as Google one.
mm. I see. I'm curious about Netflix as well. Your time there was a little limited. Do you mind
Yeah, I was only there
sharing that
for
a
a very
little bit?
short time. Yeah, so I didn't really get to experience that, but like Netflix from all aspects, it's a really fast company. It is also about Facebook को चाहिँ if you compare Netflix or Facebook, Netflix uses a lot of stack. Maybe that is maybe externally available, like from let's say like AWS or say tooling or होइन.
Mm,
Like with Facebook, they pretty much built all the tooling that they need to build internally. So they have incredibly highly scalable systems, highly scalable. About if you talk about data structures in a very distributed scale manner, again, depending on these companies operate at like a different distributed level scale, and so we're not talking about like startup
mm,
level scale. So Facebook was internal tooling, same with Google, right? Internal tooling also incredibly powerful or strong. You talk about like any of these things, they have that, right? Like for example, like let's talk about like a very tiny example, right? Like let's say you want a like a caching layer that is extremely like available, right, in a distributed way. Any एकदमै like obviously very like high throughput, एकदमै velocity राम्रो छ, तर right needs a high छैन भने Facebook already has that tool, किनभने it's a recurring pattern and they have a thing, very easy to use. You just like dump a table, just like put it in this, run this pipeline. It just like dumps it in there. But Netflix, they don't have that kind of like big engineering resource in terms of like engineering team that close and they would use probably more off the shelf like products, right?
Mm,
Maybe more rely on the traditional wider used stuff. Google
yeah.
obviously they will have their own thing. So the differences in is basically in terms of tooling. I think in terms of philosophy, the velocity is much higher in Netflix and Facebook. Google could say maybe not, like it's slightly, the velocity is like not as high as like Facebook and Netflix.
Mm, I see. Sounds like Facebook definitely invests in making their own tools and invest in engineering problems as well, whereas Netflix is very much focused on their product problems, engineering problems, like probably a little bit as well. I'm sure they do some stuff, but more or less they try to use off-the-shelf products like AWS services and whatnot.
Yeah, essentially, and also like it's a scale problem, right? Like because just like if you look at the engineering team size and like Facebook and Google, it's just like crazy huge, right?
Yeah.
And so they have the engineering resources to build out the systems. On Netflix, or if you're working at a much smaller scale startup, um, then they might not necessarily have the infrastructure like need at that point in time, and they just rely on like off the shelf stuff. I don't know.
So stuff. Next question is more around like what are like the values and principles that you kind of like are your steering I don't know guideline towards navigating your career decisions. Maybe you're switching different companies, going from a big company to a startup, maybe back to a big company like you've done. So what has been those like values and principles that have like guided you throughout, and how have they like evolved over time as your career has evolved?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So, in terms of values, like if you think about it, right? So, I mean, like at different levels, like all of the guys that are like here and also like across the industry and across the world, I'm guessing, right?
Mm,
Learning, saying everybody prioritizes. It's a very fundamental like human condition. Like, you want to grow, you want to learn, and
mm,
it's just like encoded in the human DNA in some sense. So that's definitely always there. तर त्यो बाहेक चाहिँ when you have like the ability that the Silicon Valley companies have, the impact is very huge, so that definitely draws me a lot, right? So like one example is just like Google but a Facebook massive when I saw I actually moved to internet.org, and it was an
mm,
initiative, I don't know how much awareness that you guys have about internet.org, and like because media coverage is always high or low, and media coverage is also like pros and cons and everything. But internet.org को initiative को high level idea चाहिँ just to like reflect on the impact and the mission side, right? Of mission मा चाहिँ am I aligned with that mission? Do I connect with that mission? internet.org मा चाहिँ अब high level idea चाहिँ यो हो क्या अब संसारमा चाहिँ इन्टरनेटले गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ आई थिङ्क इकोनोमी र मान्छेहरूको लाइफ चाहिँ ट्रान्सफर्म गरेकै छ होइन इट्स बिन एभिडेन्स अगेन एन्ड अगेन थ्रु मेनी स्टडिज टु एन्ड देयर हेभ बिन एक्चुली लाइक गुड स्टडिज सोइङ द्याट राइट लाइक द इकोनोमिक इम्पावरमेन्ट द भेलोसिटी lots of things get transformed. And so internet is a good thing. The internet is also a good thing because for business reasons, right? A lot of the companies are Silicon Valley, they are very global, right? Like they're not just like America, they are like globally available across the world. On त्यो केसमा चाहिँ त्यो सिनारियोमा चाहिँ in some ways internet number of internet users is sort of like your headroom saying it's like a cap in some ways. If you
mm,
have right, what is the latest number? Maybe 4 billion internet users across the world, right? But there's like 7 billion people, right? And some people are effectively like children or like very old. But like, if you talk about that, you could say like maybe legitimately, like 5 to 6 billion people could be using the internet and driving a lot of value out of that, right? They can be using the internet services and they can really do a lot of good stuff with it, right? They can connect with each other like we're doing right now through Zoom. Like like even though you are in Dharan and you are in Nepal and you are in here and there, or you're in like Seattle and I'm in Mountain View, we are going very able to effectively do this, right? So internet
mm,
obviously it's not controversial that internet is useful, but it's also like a legitimate business need for companies. So Facebook was actually यसमा चाहिँ कस्तो हुन्छ नि अब कति कम्पनीहरूले चाहिँ they'll say hey like we're doing this thing, it's good for the world भन्छ, and then they just say and then that's it, that's what it is, and then people say well but is that really why you're doing it? Facebook was very clear, they say like it's also good for us too, and I really like the honesty in that aspect. yeah, it's good for us. It's good for all the entire ecosystem of internet users, right? All of us Silicon Valley folks, Silicon Valley companies, but also it's useful for the संसारलाई पनि हैन. So it's helpful for all. अनि अर्को चाहिँ उनीहरूको चाहिँ strategy चाहिँ it was very good. It was very like practical in some ways, very lack of ego in some ways, right? Here अब फेसबुकले चाहिँ आफ्नो इन्जिनियरिङ टुलिङहरू इन्टरनली बनाए पनि यहाँ चाहिँ उनीहरूले के भने who has internet भनेर भन्ने बेलामा चाहिँ like big giant telcos अब तिम्रो चाहिँ you can see like right like अब नेपालमा चाहिँ अब NTC छ हैन अब Ncell छ like there's like various like telecommunication companies and they invest like trillions of dollars in the infrastructure, right? Like to improve the infrastructure, to make it faster, to have better reach, better coverage. And they said, hey, like those guys have access to people, they have the infrastructure. So we're going to work together with them in this aligned goal, right? It's helpful for the people, it's aligned, it's good for you, the telcos, and it's good for us, the business, and also Silicon Valley in overall. And they were very like honest and transparent about it. And I said, hey, this is I like this idea, right? Like I like this idea. I like that it's helping countries like Nepal and elsewhere, right? So obviously my point being that, when I like values in terms of that would be also that, right? Like say like, hey, I'm focused on impact because clearly it's, if you can increase the internet users, it's useful, but also there's also values in terms of like mission alignment, right? Am I aligned with this mission? Is this mission really, does it really resonate with me and whatnot? And are they just like pretending, or are they like being honest and transparent and whatnot? So there's a bunch of stuff like that goes into like that, and over the careers, I think it has evolved in like tiny ways here and there, but I think it's largely stayed the same.
Definitely impact focused heavy, or impact is one of the big factors that influence your decisions.
Yeah, definitely.
And mission alignment. Cool. Another question I was curious about is you've worked in a startup environment as well, and you've of course worked in many big companies. How did you find the experience between like working in a big ship and a small ship, and what is your kind of preference style of like working? Do you find like the bigger companies are more interesting or like a suited environment for you, or I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the startup versus like big company choice.
Yeah, so like startups, more like two other friends, we basically like did this startup, and we ultimately joined into like a bigger startup. But the startup was basically focused on survey experimentation. So experimentation like A/B testing भनौँ न. अब A/B testing चाहिँ अब कस्तो हुन्छ भने यो कुरा राम्रो कि यो कुरा राम्रो भन्ने होला, you want to do an A/B test, right? Silicon Valley मा चाहिँ it's very popular. And यो चाहिँ like about a survey based platform. अनि अब यो चाहिँ फेरि अब like political landscape मा भनौँ न हैन. So यो चाहिँ अब यो combined effort चाहिँ एउटा साथीको, it wasn't my idea. म चाहिँ अब I'm the engineering brains. अर्को साथी चाहिँ product manager थियो, and he really knew this space inside out. अनि अर्को चाहिँ साथी marketing मा चाहिँ involved थियो, अनि तीनजना मिलेर चाहिँ गरेको हैन. अनि यसमा चाहिँ it was basically that exactly that, right? Survey based platform. Ani like startup ma चाहिँ the whole idea is this, right? The tooling is again back to the Netflix idea, right? Like Netflix ko चाहिँ अब obviously it's a big company, so it has a lot of internal resources पनि छ, tooling पनि छ. When you're at a tiny shop like that, or even maybe slightly bigger, 10, 100 सम्म छ भने चाहिँ a lot of the internal tooling will be probably missing, so you're going to have to like either like rely on external tooling or like build everything from scratch. So that's what it is. So that's one tooling wise. Velocity it's going to be like, I mean, you can look at it both ways, but in terms of building and in terms of bureaucracy startup it's going to be like much less when like decisions are made much quicker. We want to build things, we're in the building mode, right? When you talk about a bigger company, the spectrum switches from like building to maintenance. It's a spectrum there, right? So like it might switch a little bit more to maintenance depending on the team, on the org and the company. But I say it's going to be like a little bit like slower. It'll be like more maintenance mode. So velocity extremely high startup ma. If you talk about the spectrum, if you go to a more bigger traditional company, the velocity might be slightly slower depending on the engineering culture that you have. So velocity ma difference definitely त्यो हुन्छ. Ani tooling ma चाहिँ difference हुन्छ. But that's probably mostly it. In terms of what I prefer, I think mostly instead of startup versus this, again like the impact and mission driven nature भएको हुनाले चाहिँ whatever gets things done. In a startup ma चाहिँ like we were like doing what we were doing. It was very like simple stuff, right? Like Python चलाएर basically hitting like some rest endpoints. That's basically all it is, like
mm,
nothing fancy, and but do it reliably, do it in a good way so that it doesn't keep on breaking, right? That's where the magic happens, right? Not the building that
mhm,
thing.
right.
त्यसपछि build it in a nice and really scalable way. So I think the impact was pretty good there, and across internet.org, Facebook was, Google was, they were like I think like you wanna say, hey, like like I don't think anybody enjoys bureaucracy, but like the impact is there, so it's going to be like different depending on the scale and the velocity. So I think that's primarily what it is, like tooling and velocity.
Mm, I see. A similar decision, like I'm sure being involved in the software industry so for quite some time, being in a management track versus maybe being in a like a technical track. How have you navigated that choice?
Yeah, so basically in any of these companies, that's essentially the two tracks, right? If you talk about software engineering, you can either be managing or you can either be an IC. अनि त्यसमा चाहिँ managing, like I managed at Facebook, and manager हुने बेलामा चाहिँ there's different things that you have to take into consideration, right? So it
Mm,
depends on the company too. So अब एकजना साथीले चाहिँ धेरै पहिला चाहिँ he had worked in a very old school aerospace company, and you talk about the engineering culture and a companyको culture हेरेर कुरा गर्यो भने चाहिँ it's a very different kind of culture there, it's very top down. There's a lot of different kinds of like things that happen there, तर अब कम्पनी लाइक फेसबुक गुगलतिर गयो भने चाहिँ कस्तो हुन्छ भने चाहिँ you hire a lot of good people already, एकदम फिल्टर गरेर मान्छेहरू राम्रो राम्रो हायर गरेको हुन्छ, अनि
mm,
you sort of like focus on उनीहरूको ग्रोथमा फोकस गरिन्छ, यिनीहरूको चाहिँ you don't focus on like getting output from them so much. These are usually very driven individuals, they are really really driven, but you're more
mm,
focused on making sure that they're growing, that they're aligned with the mission of the team at least, and they're generally happy. So that's basically what it is, right? अब आइसीमा चाहिँ you get to get a hand study, you get to get build things and all. Management गर्ने बेलामा चाहिँ you get to do less of that, किनभने ultimately there's a lot of alignment that happens, अब engineerहरूलाई म्यानेज गर्नुको साथसाथमा you're sort of like informally managing the entire team in some ways. अब तिम्रो चाहिँ के भन्छ यहाँ चाहिँ एक्स्ट्रा क्रस फङ्सनल पार्टनर्स भन्छ सिलिकन भ्यालीमा चाहिँ, अब क्रस फङ्सनल पार्टनर्स भन्नाले तिमी चाहिँ इन्जिनियरसँग मात्रै काम गर्दैन, तिमी चाहिँ डिजाइनरहरूसँग काम गर्छौ, प्रडक्ट म्यानेजरसँग काम गर्छौ, तिम्रो पिएमएम भन्छ, जस्तै अब प्रडक्ट मार्केटिङ म्यानेजरहरू भन्छन् होइन, मार्केटिङको मान्छेहरू हुन्छ, अब यता चाहिँ फेरि डेटा साइन्टिस्टहरू पनि हुन्छन् जुन चाहिँ अब दे फोकस अन मोर एनालिसिस एन्ड वाट नट। फेरि अर्को फेसबुकमा चाहिँ स्पेसिफिक ग्रोथ म्यानेजर भन्ने पनि हुन्छ होइन, त्यो भएर चाहिँ ग्रोथ मार्केटिङ भन्ने नि हुन्छ। त्यही भएर there's an entire ecosystem of folks that you need to be constantly interfacing with, and you're sort of like the liaison and sort of like interfacing with across the board. So inevitably manager हुने बेलामा चाहिँ like huge volume before time you're spending in meetings, meeting after meeting हुन्छ होइन, but
mm,
as an IC you spend time in much less meetings and you're like solving like and building things. So that's sort of like the sort of like the differences in the two different tracks. अब people also talk about like moving up the ladder, right? Like so corporate ladder मा चाहिँ अब आएपछि people talk about getting promoted. अब कस्तो भन्छ भने चाहिँ अब it depends on your own priorities होइन, you say like hey I want to next level मा पुग्छु, म next level मा पुग्छु, किन पुग्छु, maybe धेरै अब responsibility हुनसक्छ, धेरै impact हुन्छ, धेरै पैसा हुनसक्छ, धेरै चाहिँ like more learning हुन्छ, there is different like things.
mm,
Again back to your question about like what do you value होइन, त्यो
yeah,
भएर चाहिँ when you talk about management trackमा चाहिँ usually like growth चाहिँ कसरी हुन्छ भने you start managing more and more people, and at some point you start managing अरू managerहरू, and at some point you start managing managers who manage other people, and then effectively at some point you become like what they call a director in like this kind of companies,
yeah,
Facebook, Google, जुनमा चाहिँ you're managing a little bit of an organization. IC trackमा चाहिँ if you try to like get like to that kind of like incredibly high level, it's going to be like trickier and trickier, but it depends on the kind of velocity that you want for yourself. Also, obviously, it also aligns with your own interest and what you want to do. Career
mm,
goals, aspirations by say, what do you want to get out of your career? What do you want to learn? What do you want to get out of it? I think these are all like the different nuances and trade-offs.
mm. What have you chosen for now, at least?
For now, it's basically I think velocity, like Facebook months I managed, I enjoyed it a lot. Like engineers are saying, it's a lot of fun. It's really good. Meetings really get to you. It's really एकदमै high volume of meetings हुन्छ होइन. Google चाहिँ अहिले चाहिँ I'm basically working in IC, and definitely velocity is definitely much higher. I'm much less involved in meetings and whatnot. So yeah.
Mm, Cool, cool. No, thank you for sharing your perspective. Now let's shift gears a little bit into academia as well. You did your undergrad in Georgia Tech, and then you did your master's as well as PhD before uh, moving into industry. So in between those points, from maybe master's to PhD, and from PhD to whether to continue to be in academia or get into industry, what kind of like, I don't know, thought process or advice would you have for anybody maybe going through a similar journey as you did?
Yeah, I think masters to PhD. So like in general, like American university, if you are doing an undergrad, like whether America होस् या नेपालमा होस् या युरोपमा होस्, अब डाइरेक्टली पिएचडीमा चाहिँ धेरै नै मान्छेहरू नै आउँछन्, कतिहरू चाहिँ मास्टर्स गर्छन् अनि मास्टर्स गरेपछि मास्टर्स गर्दा गर्दा रिसर्च इन्ट्रेस्टहरू भएर प्रोफेसरसँग अलाइन भएपछि पिएचडी गर्न थाल्छन्। त्यो भएर इट डिपेन्ड्स अन द्याट। फर मी वाट ह्यापन वाज द फलोइङ। अब again, these are a lot of these things are, I mean, I understand these are all like accidental luck in some ways, होइन, तर चाहिँ
Mhm.
सुरुमा चाहिँ अन्डरग्रेड गर्ने बेला I had no intention of doing a master's. I was just like अन्डरग्रेड गर्छु म, त्यसपछि I'm just gonna go work in industry भन्ने चाहिँ मेरो गोल थियो होइन। अनि एकजना चाहिँ एकाडेमिक एडभाइजरले, she convinced me, she said, hey Topraj, like masters saying after you start working you'll probably never do a master's, right? I said, yeah, that's true. I said, like, it only takes about a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years. And
Mm.
also Georgia Tech जस्तो ठाउँमा गऱ्यो भने चाहिँ they practically even like pay for your tuition, and त्यसपछि even they even give you a stipend भन्छ होइन।
Mm.
So why don't you just do a master? It won't take you a long time. I said, yeah, she has a good point भन्यो होइन। त्यसपछि I did a master's. अनि अन्डरग्रेड गर्दा गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ I used to room together with a bunch of other like graduate students, PhD गर्दै गरिरहेको विद्यार्थीहरू होइन। अनि we're good friends with and all of us were really good friends. दुईजना undergrad अनि चारजना चाहिँ PhDहरू थिए होइन। अनि we used to like hang out a lot, like do a lot of stuff, and I used to like enjoy what they were doing, right? It was like research but in a very different kind of setting and all. एकजना चाहिँ कम्प्युटर साइन्समा गर्थ्यो, अरू चाहिँ मेकानिकल इन्जिनियर, इन्डस्ट्रियल इन्जिनियर, भिन्न भिन्न टपिकहरूमा होइन। अनि मास्टर्स गर्दा गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ रिसर्च गर्दा गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ मास्टर्स गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ यु अल्सो डु रिसर्च, what they call graduate research assistancy भन्छ होइन। रिसर्च गर्ने बेलामा चाहिँ they basically you do research, and by doing research and being employed as a researcher उनीहरूले चाहिँ ट्युसन पनि दिन्छ, फ्री गरिदिन्छ अनि स्टाइपेन्ड पनि दिन्छ होइन। स्टाइपेन्ड भन्नाले
Mm.
पैसा दिन्छ होइन।
Yeah.
It's not a lot, धेरै दिँदैन, तर enough to like for you to survive and have a reasonable life. अनि त्यो भएर चाहिँ मास्टर्स गर्दा गर्दा प्रोफेसरले चाहिँ why don't you like think about it and do that भन्यो। अनि साथीहरू पनि लाइक गरेको साथीहरू पनि थाहा थियो, साथी एकदम साथी मिल्ने साथीहरू, त्यो भएर चाहिँ I thought it was a good idea। अनि from Nepal back then, अहिले चाहिँ I think the volume of computer science PhD चाहिँ it's been increasing steadily. But back then चाहिँ there weren't a lot of people doing computer science PhD from Nepal, so I said, hey, this could be useful for the long term, in terms of the long term stuff that I want to do, and this is a good thing to be doing in general, and it takes a couple of years, and what's the hurry भन्ने चाहिँ कुरा। त्यो भएर चाहिँ I did that. It was a lot of fun, obviously. I mean, accidental thing aside, I obviously enjoyed research a lot, right? Research चाहिँ गर्न एकदम मजा लाग्थ्यो, त्यो भएर चाहिँ I used to enjoy that a lot होइन। त्यो भएर that was the decision behind PhD. PhD to academia versus industry मा चाहिँ, so the journey I had selected for myself when I started at the beginning of my PhD journey was I'm gonna be an academic, and that's how I create impact in the world and also create impact eventually in Nepal. That was the idea, right? अब last year of PhD मा चाहिँ, and that was what I would actually like set on. अनि postdoc पनि अब line up भइसकेको थियो, अनि I was gonna do a postdoc after maybe 6 months पछि चाहिँ त्यो ल्याबमा चाहिँ गएर काम गर्ने। त्यसपछि चाहिँ with one of my collaborators produce more papers. मान्छे ट्रेडिसनली के गर्छन् एकाडेमिकमा, पिएचडी गरेपछि पोस्टडक गर्छ, त्यसपछि चाहिँ प्रोफेसर बन्छन् होइन। अनि आई वाज लाइक ओके द्याट्स द पाथ आइम गोना टेक। तर लास्ट इयरमा चाहिँ मैले इन्टर्नसिप गरेँ जुन चाहिँ C21U भन्ने एउटा इनिसिएटिभ थियो विदिन जोर्जिया टेक होइन। अगेन वान अफ दोज एक्सिडेन्टल थिङ्स, मेरो प्रोफेसरले चाहिँ हे टोप्राज, you love Nepal, you want to do stuff for Nepal, and why don't you like look at this thing, internship गर्ने भनेर भनेछ। It was like JavaScript code अलिअलि, nothing that high value, तर चाहिँ from personal perspective, तर चाहिँ it was good to be embedded there to learn that. And so learn गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ they were focused more on the digital transformation, that the digital technology, Udacity, Coursera त्यो बेला आउँदै थियो होइन। अनि युनिभर्सिटीहरू चाहिँ they were like really shaken, अनि the digital revolution is coming and it's going to really transform the university landscape भन्नु त्यो सोच्ने बेलामा त्यहाँ इम्बेड भएर चाहिँ त्यहाँको मान्छेसँग इन्टरेक्ट गर्दा गर्दा चाहिँ I realized your academic journey चाहिँ that was probably not the optimal way of like creating impact. I needed real world experience. त्यो भएर चाहिँ I switched to like industry role.
Let's see. And speaking of doing things in Nepal, you do have an initiative, GAN initiative. Can you tell us more about what the project is and what's like the vision behind the project?
Yes, basically a collection of us three friends. So तिनजना साथीहरू छ, एकजना चाहिँ जापानमा छन् साथी होइन, उता प्रोफेसर हो, विष्णु प्रसाद गौतम उता जापानमा प्रोफेसर छन् होइन। अर्को
Mm,
साथी चाहिँ ओम प्रकाश ग्यावाली, दाई साथी होइन, ओम प्रकाश ग्यावाली हो, ऊ चाहिँ युनिभर्सिटी ह्युस्टनमा चाहिँ प्रोफेसर छन् होइन। अनि म भयो, म चाहिँ इन्डस्ट्री, सो दिस लाइक अ जापान प्रोफेसर, अमेरिकन प्रोफेसर, अमेरिका युनिभर्सिटी प्रोफेसर एन्ड इन्डस्ट्री एक्सपर्ट इन सम फर्म अर द अदर, we
mm,
three have like come together and say, hey, like of your technology, digital transformation त भइरहेछ at incredible like velocity होइन, अनि how can we use and leverage this technology aspect, especially like smartphone penetration चाहिँ एकदमै हाई छ नेपालमा होइन, अनि त्यसपछि
mm,
इन्टरनेट पेनिट्रेसन पनि अब हायर एन्ड हायर भइरहेछ होइन, like thanks to like all these telcos होइन, and also like other providers, त्यो भएर चाहिँ how can you use this combination of internet penetration, mobile and internet smartphone penetration and internet penetration, यसलाई चाहिँ combining it, how can we like do some things to like help in different aspects of it, whether it's education or whether it's like employment or whether it's like like government services or like tourism, there's many sectors, right? So we're sort of like thinking about like those kind of spaces. So that's basically what it is, and we've done like a couple of experiments in that space, mostly in that experiment education space, but that's the idea, to sort of like take this idea, run with it, and then sort of like see if we can scale it up to a reasonable level.
mm. I see. Now, final question before we move on to Q&A. I know we've been going on at it for quite some time now. What changes do you foresee in like the tech landscape in the next 10 year or so? Anything that you're like super excited about, or something that maybe even scares you, AI and whatnot? I'd be curious to what your thought is around like the software field and the technology field in general.
Yeah, so I think policy concerns aside, right, like obviously like with the power of AI, the power of like like the advent of misinformation and all these digital platforms,
Mm,
right? Like these are all like extremely important issues, and I have like utmost faith and respect in these companies to be able to solve this. Not just the companies, the regulators, policymakers, everybody comes together and tries to solve this, right? There's all these like big questions, right? Whether it's misinformation, whether it's about like AI and it's like like pros and cons, right? So that
mm,
aside, like more so than technology and like as a technologist, I'm more interested in like Nepal. So I'm like in the next 10 years, like obviously like with the advent of like all these like digital technologies and whatnot, hopefully like over time in the next 10 years, like a lot of these things and companies will be more, a lot of companies will emerge in this like space, and there will be a lot of adoption of these technologies, so that like the country can evolve rapidly in the path of development, not the software development but the traditional policy development.
mm,
Ani, तर यता in terms of the US journey like it's very clear, right? Like Eric Schmidt, who is the former CEO of like Google, right? Like in one of his talks a while back, right? Not like last year, but maybe a couple of years ago, he said, "Hey, like software industry, because if you look at the entire like space software industry, he's saying like we're only seeing this is the tip of the iceberg ones, and
mm,
this is like such an revolutionary thing. So in terms of technology and more so than ML and the transformative power that ML and AI has, or like specific technology or like cryptocurrency or whatnot, I'm more like excited about how software industry is. It's going to transform radically a lot of the different industry that exists right now, right? Like what Uber and
mm,
Airbnb has done for like traditional the taxi industry and the hotel industry, and going all the way across the board. Like we're talking about like fintech and like obviously about like pharma, but you can imagine like across the board, humanity like it's tiny. Every possible services are like saying, like technology companies tend to make it a little bit more efficient, and maybe it like creates new things that can like it allows you to do new things that were not physically possible in the past, right? So like I'm really like looking forward to that, and it's gonna be like a beautiful and fun journey, right? And it's
mm.
obviously means that for software engineering it's gonna be like great.
Yeah, yeah. It is definitely a, I don't know, I talk with friends about like it is a little bit of a bubble as well, like especially coming right out of college, and like the amount of like the if you're comparing career options between tech and elsewhere, like it's definitely much better in tech, and more as everything becomes more automated and integrated with software. the demand for engineers is just gonna expand. There's a lot more people going into school for engineering too, which is also very exciting.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think like career option wise, right? Like I mean, volume via software engineering, because demand is going to be incredibly high ones, right? But just because of the demand and the global nature of all these companies, right? All these companies are not operating in the old school way of like local pockets of business. These are like everything
Mm-hmm.
is global, right? Thanks to the power of the
Mm-hmm.
internet. अनि त्यो भएर चाहिँ like the career-मा चाहिँ like we talk, this is very important, like the money and in the software engineering industry-मा चाहिँ it's becoming incredibly high होइन अनि त्यो भएर चाहिँ it's been an attractive career option in terms of like, hey, if you want to like get like a good, everybody thinks about financial security for themselves, and they might or might not care about computer science as much as the other person, but it still is a great career in terms of, hey, like if they could be doing mechanical engineering versus civil engineering versus computer science, they might get more drawn to computers just because like the money might be higher there, right? So it's going to be like an interesting like journey to see in the next 10 years.
Yeah, 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 definitely. Barriers to entry are much lower than any other field that you can imagine. Cool.
Oh yeah,
Thank you.
definitely.
Thank you for spending time with us. Now I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. If you have any question and if you're comfortable sharing it like over the video and audio, so feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. Or if you want to type question on the chat feature in Zoom, you can ask your question that way as well.
Hey, I had a question.
Mm-hmm.
Sudma milcha अहिले? Okay.
Of course, go
First
ahead.
of all, thank you, Day. This was very awesome. Let me enjoy. I really enjoyed it today. I wanted to ask a little bit more about your PhD. Like, what was it in? What like is that related to kind of the work that you're doing now at all, or like what was the project, and did you like it? Yeah, it's a good question, Samantha. So like PhD saying it was basically focused on this thing called like 3D mesh compression. So like if you talk about like
Mm,
computer graphics, right? Like computer graphics भन्नाले broadly speaking अब video game इन्डस्ट्रीलाई हेऱ्यो भने अथवा एनिमेसन इन्डस्ट्रीलाई हेऱ्यो भने अथवा साइन्टिफिक कम्युनिटीमा नि अब obviously computer graphics आउँछ होइन. It was I chose that topic as my like PhD area मा किनभने undergraduate-मा चाहिँ who was my eventual PhD advisor, he taught that undergraduate, I just loved it. And it's a combination of algorithms, visualization also, but also like math and also like computers, right? So it's a good ideal blend of like all the things I love. And PhD dissertation say it was basically like I did a lot of research that wasn't probably covered in the dissertation itself. But the dissertation say it was in basically what they call 3D mesh compression. But the idea is the following, right? If you have a mesh, like a 3D mesh, the triangle mesh ones, and this is a video game, all these characters are made out of either polygonal meshes or usually triangle meshes. GPUs are extremely like tuned for like rasterizing like triangles. Like this saying, can you like compress these things to a reasonable scale? One question, fundamental theoretical question, and more than a practical question, it was a more good fun theoretical question. And we basically did that. We solved that problem. We made incredible gains. I think it was probably like 32x kind of like improvement. It was a progressive set of there's like 4 papers, I believe. Yeah, 4 papers published. Every paper, let's say, it made like like 2x gain, 3x gain, maybe like 8x gain. Ultimately it was like a 32x gain from the start to the end. And it was like a lot of fun, including it being random access and whatnot. Like the compression one, zip compression, just compressed but still like randomly accessible. So that was what it was. So it's a very like niche space, as is the case with most PhD topics. Incredibly fun though, right? Because your topic it allows you to think very deeply about something, but you're thinking also broadly about different kind of things. So that was the PhD. Google Maps, basically when I joined a different team initially. Google Maps Google Maps दुईचोटि काम गरेँ. सुरुमा गयो, त्यसपछि फेसबुक गयो, त्यसपछि फेरि गुगलमा फर्केर आएन. गुगलमा सुरुमा चाहिँ गर्ने बेलामा चाहिँ एउटा टिम थियो जुनमा चाहिँ मैले 3D ग्राफिक्स चलाएर चाहिँ what they call mesh processing भन्छ होइन. त्यो चाहिँ we did that होइन. It was a lot of fun. त्यो बेलामा चाहिँ के भन्छ भने यो triangle meshलाई नै लिएर चाहिँ can you make that smaller? We are talking about millions of triangles, and we wanted to surface this in the web. 3D चाहिँ webमा surface गर्नको लागि नि त्यो हुने बेलामा चाहिँ can we like compress this, like can we make this not compress this but like make this smaller, can we represent this million mesh with like maybe a few hundred, a few thousand, including texturing. But just a problem or solve गर्यो. So it was a lot of fun. Like Google चाहिँ गर्यो. Second time around मा चाहिँ right now like I'm in search, तर चाहिँ I'm going to join another team in again 3D graphics. I'm going to solve again similar problems, very aligned with what I did in a PhD. It's going to be like what can we do like in the 3D graphics space. So that's basically like the high level what it was. Oh, is there a question? I think yes, Srihar
Yeah,
has a
there's a
question.
question. Yeah,
Yeah.
Sridhar has a question in the chat box. What advice would you give to a junior in college to get into FANG companies? First question.
I got it. So these FANG companies, like just to be honest, brutally honest, कस्तो हुन्छ भने चाहिँ you to get into any FANG company or any non-FANG. Like, I mean, non-FANG companies are really great too, by the way, but FANG is just like by popular because उनीहरूको चाहिँ अब maybe compensation पनि राम्रो छ. I mean, maybe reputation पनि राम्रो छ. There's a lot of like good positive things about it. So people do target FANG company. FANG company जानको लागि चाहिँ as a junior or as a sophomore or even as a freshman, like high level, this is basically the 2-level process. I mean, easier said than done, but this is what it is again. So first thing is you have to get the interview, and second thing is you have to pass the interview. That's essentially what it is, right? It's almost like trivializing the thing of like, hey, how do you do X? Like you have to first like plan for X and then do X. It's like, okay, that's not really a plan, but anyway, like those two aside, those two are basically what it is, right? Like you have to get an interview and you have to pass the interview. Okay, so get the interview. How do you do that, right? So usually त्यो गर्नको लागि चाहिँ mechanism चाहिँ there's a multiple way. There's an internship route to given you're a junior. So I'm just going to talk about that in the end, but I think just talk about the general one, right? To get the interview, one is saying about some of the best mechanisms. So if you have other friends who are already in FANG, and that's the best way. That's what they do, what they call referrals. Referral गर्यो भने चाहिँ basically philosophy चाहिँ के भने companyहरुको good we hire good people. Every company hires good people. I don't think any company says we hire bad people. Like, every company hires good people, and our employees who are good people know other good people. That's the idea. So that's the idea behind referral. So they ask their employees to refer other people. तिम्रो कोही साथीहरु छ भने it becomes slightly easier, right? त्यो सुरुमा इन्टरभ्यु पाउनको लागि. And obviously show up your resume, make sure your resume मा चाहिँ तिमीले independent projectहरु गरेछौ, राम्रो छ. But that's not as like highly critical भनौं न एक हिसाबले सोच्यो भने चाहिँ. It's mostly the referral is important. If not the referral, then somehow you have to get the interview, right? Maybe the recruiter really likes you because there are certain things in your resume that they really love. So that's one thing. Now, how do you pass the interview? That's the hardest part, right? Like getting the interview is usually not as hard as getting the passing the interview. Passing the interview, like we talked about, obviously, let's say by questions, so algorithmic technical interviewer, they ask algorithmic question. If you are talking about like junior level questions, because you're a junior, right? Like so, junior engineers, I say, it's a coincidence that you're a junior in college, but it's a junior engineers, right? Like when you're like more like entry level engineer, and more senior engineers, slightly different. Junior engineer, like say, you're basically mostly relying on this thing, right? Algorithmic like technical questions. And just like say, I would just recommend just doing that, right? Just do a lot of practice, a lot of those. Like we talked about lead code when you saw lead code ma say they have what they have a subscription package once. And I'm not a like lead code saying like I'm not like but it's a referral bonus pound. They have actually like this monthly subscription when I say they open up कुन question कुन चाहिँ कम्पनीमा जाने हो त्यो क्वेसनमा चाहिँ उनीहरूको कम्युनिटीले नै ट्याग गरेको क्वेसनहरु छ हैन नि देन यु गेट टु प्र्याक्टिस कम्पनी स्पेसिफिक क्वेसनहरु पनि गर्न पाउँछ हैन तर चाहिँ त्यसमा फीहरु लाग्छ कति $20-30 कति छ हैन per month. And I think that's pretty useful. And besides that, just like practice lead code, I would say people, it's a people practice differently, but I would say a minimum like 100, 200, but not like easy medium questions. When you go into lead code, you'll understand most of the medium questions and some hard questions. And it's going to be hard, it's going to be painful depending on your own like capacity or the kind of like background or the exposure that you have had. So like if it is easy for you, then that's great for you, then you just like practice that. But if it becomes hard for you, then just like go through just go through the process and just really try and understand. It's just like learning anything, right? When you're going through college is already that hard. You can think of this as yet another one course in your college, but like a 3-month course. It has like a couple of hours of lectures, a couple of hours of homework, a couple of hours of exams, and there's a final exam in the end, but there's like many companies that are giving you the final exam, but you can think of it that way. So by which I mean you have to just justify तिमीले टन्नै टाइम हाल्नुपर्छ त्यसमा हैन and it is for most people it's just a time thing हैन for people who have done competitive programming like me or other friends of mine it becomes a slightly different problem case because like we've seen a lot of these kind of problems before so it becomes mostly warming up brushing up but even then for me to more like I don't I like to over prepare so even when I'm like going back to Google even though I have worked at Google before or even when I went to Facebook initially even though I know these problems I still practiced lead code a lot like I would say like maybe easily 100 plus problems medium harder right and even though like I said मैले चाहिँ अलिकति competitive program गर्ने मेरो चाहिँ background हुँदाखेरि पनि I practice a lot of this I give it a lot of time practice a lot of these things because you don't want to leave things to chance you want to make sure that you're at the top of your game so that's basically what I would say just put in a lot of time and effort into this and the payoff is like it could be FANG companies but even non-FANG right like of NVIDIA say like any of these like wonderful companies that are out there right that are really really good and you can still like have a wonderful career there you can learn a lot you can make a lot of money obviously and you can have a lot of good friends right त्यो चाहिँ साइड्स अब जुनियर कलेजमा भएको नाताले चाहिँ you can still go the internship path and that is actually a really good path but the thing is the following you still need to do the त्यो lead code style problemहरू चाहिँ गर्नै पर्छ फेरि हैन जस्तै अब डिफरेन्सेस चाहिँ कस्तो छ भने अब फेसबुकमा गयो भने चाहिँ as soon as you like do the like they will ask you one or two maybe algorithmic calculation technical question maybe they will grade you maybe slightly but it'll be like similar grading and they won't be like oh you are an intern so it won't be really that it'll be still tough तर that is a good way internship तिमी जस्तै अब फेसबुक गरेछौ भने तिमी junior छ भने or even a sophomore छ भने चाहिँ they'll say junior mostly then they'll say hey like तिमी summer internship गरेछौ we'll just like to give you a return offer भन्छ हैन and it's usually like a good path to doing that so I think those are like the different options but unfortunately it is a difficult journey but again it's the same thing the two-step process get the interview and pass the interview but and this process is very well publicized it's very well known it's just a matter of putting in the time the hours and the commitment depending on your obviously your goals and whatnot so that's basically what it is यो अर्को क्वेशन पनि
अर्को क्वेशन पनि श्रीधर के हो is paying a considerable sum for masters in a top-notch college just better over fully funded PhDs in state universities provided that I want to get into industry in the long run
yeah so I think it depends right like it depends on what you want to do like I mean getting into industry it might go beyond that too right like for example let's say तिमी चाहिँ अब राम्रो top notch प्रोग्राममा गयो अरे and top notch कलेजमा गयो अरे that network of friends that you have there is also like pretty valuable in some form or the other right and there might be like a good value there but it depends on your own like position like in this kind of like setup the way you have set it up like big sum of money to do a master's in top-notch college versus a state funded fully state funded PhD in a state university I would probably say the latter just because it's a considerable sum of money right like especially when you're a student especially in Nepal so like, it's a big sum of money right I would probably say that state funded PhD there are paths right like you don't have to complete the PhD I'm not saying like you go and say you want to do a PhD and then get out with a master's like sometimes like mancheru चाहिँ PhD गर्ने भनेर enter गर्छ and they realize hey this is not for me for some form or the other no like it's not like PhD गर्यो भन्दामा this is better than that there's nothing like that right everything is like what is good for you what works for you that's basically what it is right oh you मान्छेले PhD गरेछ it must be good oh you मान्छेले यो company गरेछ it's not really like that whatever works for you whatever is good for you अब तिमी चाहिँ state funded PhD मा चाहिँ state university मा गएछ भने चाहिँ if you like it and you do it and that's great for you but if you say hey like after 2 years I say like this is not for me I don't really like it they actually most of these universities as a part of the PhD actually have you do sort of like a master's like have you do all the requirements for the master's too so you can technically sort of say hey like I'm just graduating with a master's and you can go directly to industry so there's like various paths I obviously don't advocate you to say fully going in to Garni like the other path is also the following right like if you get into like this your dream school like a top-notch master's program but initially they say there's no like funding for you तिमीले चाहिँ पे गर्नुपर्छ भने चाहिँ there's one bet you can do on yourself with good homework good research त्यो युनिभर्सिटीको चाहिँ कहिलेकाहीँ चाहिँ कति प्रोफेसरहरू हुन्छ उनीहरूले चाहिँ ग्रेजुएट रिसर्च एसिस्टेन्टहरू राख्छन् कतिले चाहिँ ग्रेजुएट टिचिङ एसिस्टेन्टहरू राख्छन् होइन अनि त्यो तिमीले पायो भने रोल चाहिँ त्यो सेम थिङ कि स्टेट फन्डेड भने जस्तो तिमीले चाहिँ स्टाइपेन्ड पाउँछ अनि तिम्रो ट्युसन चाहिँ वेभ गरिदिन्छ सो द्याट्स अ ग्रेट अप्सन बट द्याट अप्सन might not exist in day one होइन अनि कति युनिभर्सिटी जोर्जिया टेकमा चाहिँ त्यो अप्सन थियो जोर्जिया टेकमा चाहिँ कस्तो अप्सन थियो भने you could come in with a master's as a full paying master student तर चाहिँ within a month and a half if you're able to get a PhD like sorry not a PhD a master's role where you are a graduate research assistant or a GT a graduate teaching assistant then they actually like go retroactively they say hey like you are actually fully funded for the semester once or you could do the optional route which is like if your master's take 3 semesters you can say I'm going to pay for 1 semester but you've done adequate research and there's lots of research positions available on Timi Goara, then for the first semester you pay, which is like it's gonna be like a bummer for you. Tara second 2 semesters you put a bet on yourself and then you go, you do a good job and then that there's lots of funding and then you go there, you do deliver and especially for the last 2 semesters you get funded and maybe even they really like you and then you transition into a PhD too. So those are all the paths there. Right.
Yeah.
Thanks for your
Sridhar says thank you so much.
So
All right, I think. Sorry, go ahead, Sundar.
yeah, I have like 3 questions. You can be brief on the questions. The first question is, I guess, like you mentioned, you worked as an individual contributor to being an engineering manager, and you're like basically a contact between product managers, product marketing managers. So my question to you now, at this point in career, I'm working as a product manager, and what I want to do is build a very strong relationship with engineering managers. So the question is, how is it that I can basically like build a strong tie with my engineering manager? So there's a mutual amount of like trust and respect with the engineering managers and product managers.
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately, like from I'm just like saying a lot of things from my own personal experience, right? Some of these things I've thought a lot deeper and tried to be broader, but some of these things it's more personal experience. So this one is going to be personal experience. So like any other company, first matter of a company culture, my value and there's going to be like different kinds of company that where like PMs are deeply embedded in the engineering team. Kune company they're not as deeply embedded. So if it is not as deeply embedded, then now it's going to be slightly more difficult for you, but it's possible to overcome that, right? So ultimately, our engineering leadership relationships, it's ultimately these are all human beings and they are all like people, like we are all people. And ultimately, these are like human relationships. Yeah. So it boils down to sort of that. There is a business relationship there. Right? Like I'm trying to deliver as a product manager, I'm trying to deliver some certain things to the overall team. And as an engineering manager or an engineering leader, they're trying to deliver something or the other. But besides that, human relationships are very critical and important. So you want to sort of like do that. And the standard way to go about doing that is like, maybe you can grab lunch, you can grab dinner, you can grab coffee, but there you want to provide a space and obviously not do it every day, but every couple of few weeks or few months or in the initial, when you're in the initial stages, to do it like more frequently, to really align like yourself, like your personal life, right? To make sure that you know each other really well. You talk about like all kinds of things. It's like you're building a friendship, and it's like a known secret, right? When you're working with friends, you're going to be much more like you're going to be like much more honest, but you're going to be also more welcoming, right? So it goes like both ways, and it's like much more better in terms of that. So relationship aside, so that's one. The other side is like basically every engineering leader or every other like stakeholder, cross-functional wise, they all have their own personal goals. Obviously, their own personal goals as an individual, but as a team, right? The team is looking for a particular goal. For example, about just about Pune, a traditional big company will go out when I say this is the standard debate, okay? So an idea that might have very low engineering cost, right, might have incredible amount of impact, but an idea that has high incredible engineering like fun भनौँ न एकदमै इन्जिनियरहरू चाहिँ ग्रो गर्ने अपर्च्युनिटी दिन्छ, might not have as much impact. So it's a balance, right? And from the quote unquote political or the bureaucratic side of things, you want to be very aware of that thing. You can't just be in a vacuum and say this is what it is. And you want to be very aligned with the engineering leader on what are they looking for in terms of for their own team, because that's what they are sort of like paid to do, right? After engineering report, they want to make sure that they are happy, that they're producing, that they're really, really growing in their own personal career. When engineers are happy, they're more productive. That's like very well known, right? Therefore, you want to be very aligned on exactly what they want in their own, like what they want basically for their own engineering like folks, and that way you can are more aligned in basically what you can try and cater to like their own needs. So besides that, obviously you want to be very like forthcoming, very honest about your own like needs with the engineering leader. So hopefully the relationship is two ways. Besides that, like everybody does one-on-ones, but if you haven't been doing one-on-ones, you should have regular one-on-ones with every cross-functional partner that are very important to you, right? Like if you are not doing one-on-ones with anybody of importance to you in your own professional like relationship, you need to have weekly one-on-ones or bi-weekly, depending on how busy or you are or they are. But you need to have regular cadence where you are just like, it's you in a room where you can say things more honestly and openly, because people interact differently in a giant room setting versus in a tiny one-on-one setting. So you need to have that. But again, it goes back to, again, these are people and these have needs, and you want to identify what the needs are, and again, you want to build on the personal relationships, and that's essentially what it amounts to.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. Thank you for the advice. Second question, and this can be pretty brief as well. You transition from like a big tech to startup, like you went from like Google to Facebook to a startup and then back to Google, if I understood your journey correctly. So like what were some of the key learnings that you had while working with a relatively small group of team, or compare that to a large organization where the vision is pretty clear?
Yeah, so if you talk about like a bigger team, and even more than a bigger team or small team, it should be like bigger team that is more mature, right? Like for example, it might be a bigger team, but they are maybe infant in their product journey, right? But even then, like, so the company, if you talk about a big company, like whether it's Facebook or Google, उनीहरूको चाहिँ अब आफ्नो internal policies and internal processes हुन्छ हैन, and processes are not bad in itself. Processes are more designed to make sure or ensure that things are done in a proper way, so that make sure that things are like everybody's aligned, everything is going in a good velocity and in a good way. But inevitably, with a lot of processes comes like what they call bureaucracy or politics, right? So you that's basically like what the sort of like the trade-offs are in some form or the other, right? Like in terms of working with smaller teams, the velocity is much higher. A Facebook, my smaller team or some company, it's way velocity is much smaller, much faster, but Facebook again is by design, it is designed to be like autonomous, right? Like all these teams are very autonomous. Like I said, it's a collection of startups in some form or the other. Therefore, velocity is higher. The startup velocity incredibly high, like decisions are made very quickly. तिम्रो चाहिँ अब एकदमै हाई स्टेक्स डिसिजनहरू छ भने whether it's at Facebook or Google, अब यो चाहिँ VP लेभलमा चाहिँ डिसिजनमा पनि पुग्न सक्छ हैन. And when you talk about VP level, अब when you talk about VP level approvals in these kind of companies, right? It requires a lot of preparation, requires a lot of time, and ultimately, what happens is this, right? Like, so everybody or every team at every level, like whether it's like an IC level or at the PM level or the engineering leader level or the director level, they're all making decisions, right? And the decisions are made in the best interest of the organization or the team and whatnot. And usually, it gets surfaced all the way to a VP or even like higher, right? Like I've had like those kind of cases too. It gets to that kind of level because either there's ambiguity in the decision, right? It's not clear one decision versus the other, or there are other processes or policies in place that don't allow for that kind of. It's a new thing, right? It's a new thing, and there are other stakeholders of PMI, maybe policy stakeholder. Hey, this is something that is new, that is not we haven't invested in. So like a VP needs to really take a look into this. So there's a lot of different kinds of like stakeholders that have interest all the way up the chain, and when you go higher and higher up the chain, decisions don't get made at that breakneck velocity. तिम्रो चाहिँ अब everyday day-to-day level stakeholders चाहिँ सँगै बसेर काम गरिरहेको छ, or obviously the decisions are made much faster. But when a decision has to be made at the VP level or even higher, the decisions can take weeks or months, right? So it depends on कुन चाहिँ scale-मा छ, कुन चाहिँ level-मा छ velocity. At a startup, the decisions are much faster. It's very easy, right? The decisions are, it's just like us three friends are just making decisions very quickly, and we're there. We know what the pros and cons are. We've evaluated what the pros and cons are, what the different options are, what the pros and cons are for different options. And like any other decision when you're making, you have a set of options, you have pros and cons for each option, and you just evaluate that. You make the decision quickly, and you move on. At these companies, there are more nuances in the policies and all. So you have to be very, very aware of these things, and it can sort of like slow the velocity. But again, these companies operate at bigger scale. The impact is much bigger. At the startups, we are like sort of like starting out, so the scale is much smaller and the impact is smaller. So these are different trade-offs.
Yeah. Okay, sure. And so my last two questions are primarily geared towards, because like I have an aspirations to be an entrepreneur. So like last questions are geared like more towards that. Just about engineering talent like motivate them, like how should like an entrepreneur भनौँ न एउटा इनिशियल स्टेज स्टार्टअपमा चाहिँ अब कम्पनीको एउटा रोडम्याप त्यस्तो क्लियर हुँदैन जस्तो गुगलको हुन्छ या फेसबुकको हुन्छ र vision पनि त्यस्तो क्लियर हुँदैन रोडम्याप क्लियर हुँदैन इट्स लट अफ एम्बिग्युटी हैन अनि how should one keep their engineering talent like retain in the organization despite of like so many ambiguities of engineering. If I was working as an engineer, I'd be like हिजो के भनेको थियो आज के भनेको छ भोलि के भन्छ क्लियरै छैन कम्पनीको मिसनै छैन मतलब भिजन त्यस्तो क्लियर छैन भन्ने हुन्छ नि त्यो एउटा एम्बिग्युटी हुन्छ सो how to keep engineers motivated in this startup.
Yeah, so essentially like even going back before that, like so when you start a startup, if you're a non-technical co-founder, I mean let's say you're a PM, then you're technically a technical co-founder in some form with a traditionally engineering counterpart. So like if you talk about like traditional tech companies like which are nowadays and like the old school companies, right? When you look at old school companies, the old school company are might say it's a big business and technology is just a cost center once again. It's just like this thing that they do on the side. But like if you're talking about like more traditional tech companies, which I'm assuming you are like looking at, then you want to have technology as being like the thing, right? That's the revolutionary thing that you're bringing to the table, right? And if that is the case, then you probably want like a good co-founder that has that is probably a CTO level or like CEO. It doesn't matter, right? But they have to be like have like really good strong technical or engineering like chops, So at that point, like both of you are very aligned and whatnot. Now startups. Engineers join for many different reasons, like it's not like a universal reason. So one reason is basically they want like high basically learning, high growth in some ways, right? Like when you're in a startup, you get paid not a lot of money, but you get promised like of an eventual IPO at some point, some exit, right? And but more than that, some people just want to grow. They want to like build a lot of things, and and in a startup they have that kind of thing, right? Whereas in maybe a Facebook or something, maybe not that kind of breakneck speed. So definitely you get to learn a lot more. So that might be that. Again, it boils down to a counterpart of CTO, leader. He needs to really know what all these people are driven by, right? And they need to like cater to that. So that's one. The other one is like mission alignment. Again, like same thing, right? Like people love the mission. If you are, for example, if your company is saying, we're going to solve world poverty, and it's going to be through technology. I think there's going to be like thousands of people that are going to want to join a startup, right? And if you have a good idea, obviously, I'm just saying, like a random idea. But the point being, like, if the mission is so amazing and all, people are going to like want to join that, and they are very aligned with the mission, right? But besides that, they might also be focused on the monetary aspect, right? Like they might say, hey, if I join an early stage company like a startup, the payoff might be really good. Granted, given that the business idea is really good, and my percentage share of whatever that is going to be. So there may be multiple like reasons why people join in general, and you want to be very, very aware of what their reasons are. And usually the engineering leader will be hopefully be. But besides that, you also want to like if they're not aligned with the mission at a certain level, right? Maybe they don't need to drink the Kool-Aid, at the level that they say. They just like dream and think the mission, but they need to at least believe in that, and they need to believe that the strategy that you have is actually aligned and it actually very clear and is going in that right direction. And if that is the case, then people just want to grow and they want to be building things. That's usually in the engineering DNA. And if that is the case, and if you are aligned with your technical co-founder, then I think it shouldn't be like a hard thing to be able to retain. Again, the problem is this, right? You will be competing against if you want to form a startup in like Silicon Valley. If you want like the best of the best, then you'll be competing against other startups and the other like the FANG-like companies or the other Silicon Valley companies. But again, you have to sort of like revisit your own like goals and whatnot and see like the kind of caliber of people that you want. Obviously, you want the best, but it's going to be like very competitive. So you have to like evaluate all of that.
Okay, sure. And last question, and this would be, I guess, like question to a larger community. And the engineering community. So do you foresee any like government regulations in the application of ML and AI? And I'm asking this question primarily because lately I've been watching news, and like if I watch like news of, for example, like a new channel that is very much inclined towards like a Democratic Party, then like I, as an audience, do not get even a view of like what the other party is like, because the ML AI is fed in such a way that it gives me information that is already like that kind of like builds bias in me. So do you foresee any kind of like a government regulations and like application of MLAI going forward in the future? Just so like there is an inherent bias that these technology bring in the life of people.
Well, I can answer. So like you say about this is definitely a much bigger, broader question, that the whole entire industry is grappling with. But it is inevitable, right? Regulation is good in general, right? It's not like always bad. It can be good and bad, obviously. Everything has pros and cons. So अलिअलि रेगुलेसन चाहिँ it's inevitable. अब अर्को चाहिँ अब concern चाहिँ अब एउटा त अब तिमीले you're talking about bubbles and like like people in the bubble because maybe engagement is prioritized. So now people are more engaged. So you are in your own bubble, and people like that to be in your bubble. But like if you talk about like real life, that is probably what happens to that. You are probably going to have friends who are aligned with their own interests, and you're going to be listening to them. You're going to be in your own little own bubble. So like you can say like, hey, the algorithms and whatever, the AI or whatever, people have, I guess AI is like in this big giant catch-all for everything that is like algorithmic or ML or anything or the other, right? So you can argue for that, and hopefully like things like that can improve. But like regulatory frameworks need to be precise to, they need to be codified, and also we need to be precise to a certain level. So there's a lot of different nuances that you have to think about in terms of this technological like aspects, right? But besides that, right, like the other aspect about like AI in general is just like the the amount of automation that's inevitably going to happen, and how it impacts like day-to-day like jobs in general. Like if you talk about like self-driving trucks, if it is inevitable in the next 5, 10 or whatnot years, then how does that impact like the tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of jobs that are that people are doing currently in the US itself? These are all like questions that are hard to grapple with. Will there be regulation and policy level? It's unclear, right? These are all like I'm hoping that good people are like focused on these like different questions, and eventually something will come out of it. And like the other aspect, the doomsday scenario of like AI is gonna like have like this godlike presence that is gonna like create chaos in the world. त्यो पनि मान्छेले भन्छन् अब again back to the regulatory regime that's going to be instituted to make sure that the policies are really in line with making sure that society as a whole is functioning in a healthy way. त्यो चाहिँ I think these debates are going to be it's going to keep on raging for a while, in 5, 10 years. The thing is like regulation and policy making in general works really slowly. That's by design, right? Like it takes a lot of debate, and there's a lot of nuance there, and all these kind of things move at incredibly slow velocity. And on the flip side, technology moves at breakneck speed. It's incredibly fast, the velocity. It's going to be like interesting to see how they sort of like grapple with this velocity issue, right? And how, because like before the regulatory regime can be established, like there's going to be like new things and new challenges. So it's going to be interesting how the world evolves and grapples with these things. But these are probably reasonably good things to solve for, because like overall technology as a whole is producing ramli kura produce kura has, hopefully let's see how what happens.
Okay, yep, sure. I think that wraps up my questions.
Cool.
Thank you, Sundar. Thank you, Topraj for coming over and sharing your thoughts. We really appreciate it. Any final message you have for like the group or Nepali software engineering community in general?
Yeah, like this final thought, which didn't come up in the questions, was this one, which is basically like, I think technology industry is like it's this incredible gold rush was Silicon Valley and compensation high, so it has allowed a lot of people a lot of financial freedom. People talk about FIRE, this idea called FIRE, right? FIRE, right? Financial independence, or retire early once, but people inevitably retire early means basically what you want to do. And it is a position of luxury, especially of Silicon Valley अथवा यो अमेरिका अथवा चाहिँ यस्तै राम्रो राम्रो कम्पनीमा काम गर्न पाउनु हुने चाहिँ अब दाइ भाइ दिदी बहिनीहरू सबैजना, it's really fortunate position भनौँ न. So you are able to have like good savings and good चाहिँ त्यो, so that you are financially secure. अनि यो fortunate positionमा हुन पनि पाइरहेको छ. Plus additionally यो सबै कम्पनीहरू चाहिँ they have taught you incredible amounts of valuable skills, right? And these skills are incredibly valuable, right? Like in terms of being able to think strategically, right? Like at a very high level, or in terms of thinking at the execution, nitty-gritty details, the entire spectrum, depending on things, what your interests have been. So all the way from strategy to execution level, you've been able to be exposed to all kinds of nuance. So, like my question as a broader group, there's a couple of you here in today's like conversation, but like in the broader group across the whole, like यो सबै a fortunate position in terms of financial flexibility, in terms of earnings or savings, and in terms of your skills. This two blending. How can this be leveraged to help like countries like Nepal? Even though it might mean that you are physically there and helping there, or you are physically not there, but you're thinking about especially. So it's a in some ways it's a wonderful confluence of a lot of wonderful events that happen that allowed and allows a lot of the folks that are interested in this kind of topic to do this kind of things. Now, मैले भने त्यसपछि then to do any kind of thing because of smartphone penetration and internet penetration, the distribution is insanely huge. पहिला चाहिँ तिम्रो त्यस्तो distribution र reach पाउन चाहिँ एकदमै गाह्रो हुन्थ्यो. You have to do incredible amount of like sales. तिम्रो चाहिँ ठुलो sales team चाहिन्छ. Salesforce भन्ने company हो, sales team को त्यसलाई बनाएको एउटा whole team हो, multi-billion dollar company छ. त्यो भएर it was a very huge and big thing. तर now, thanks to the power of the internet, distribution is incredibly huge. Thanks to you guys all of you being in the US or elsewhere, even in Nepal, you have incredible skills, but especially our US-based folks or European-based folks, you have hopefully good companies, the financial flexibility, So can all of this be blended and combined to form something beautiful, the synergy? Nepal, it could be a for-profit company where you're trying to make money, and whether in the US money banaos, and Nepal money banaos, or regional in India and Bangladesh, or it could be a not-for-profit where you don't make any money, or rather make some revenue, but everything goes into the system. Or again, a non-profit, traditional non-profit where you don't make any money, and maybe traditional fundraising. But can you combine all of these ideas with targeting for-profit? That's like an interesting open question. And there's been a lot of interesting people, a lot of good people that have like partaken in that journey, and they're sort of like trying to like see how this thing evolves. But in the next 5 to 10 years, I would imagine that this is gonna accelerate over time. And we're not talking about like thousands of people going back to Nepal and doing these things. We're talking about maybe tens of people or maybe hundreds of people. But it's going to be an interesting journey in terms of like seeing how that kind of transformative power, right, the financial flexibility, the skills, and the reach of the internet and mobile internet penetration, and being able to build that to help the country, whether it's in a for-profit or a non-profit way, to help the country in like alleviating poverty, like development path, it's going to be an interesting journey. So I leave that as an open question to all of you to reflect on your own, which I'm pretty sure all of you are reflecting on in your own individual journey. But it'll be like an interesting thing to reflect on and also to enact on if you have the capacity or the capability or the interest in it. So that'll be an interesting thing to think about.
Thank you. Thank you, Topraj. With that, I'm also going to stop the recording.